Well, our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us now to dissect this announcement coming into effect at midnight. Welcome, Sherwin. It's been dubbed Liberation Day, this announcement of reciprocal tariffs. Donald Trump there starting off by announcing a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. Talk to us about this.
Well, it was a speech that was also populated by elements that were not related to the tariff, the reciprocal tariff announcement. So you mentioned the 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles, a moment that was cheered by automobile unions here in the United States, many of them in the Rose Garden for that announcement. There was also an announcement, a broad announcement that of 10% tariffs on all imports. So one expects that will apply to all nations that do trade with the United States. And then there were these additional taxes, Mfundo, on some 60 countries. And that's where South Africa was part of the list that he put up on that board in front of the members in the Rose Garden. I have some feedback in my ear if Control Room can just take care of that. So let's go through some of the numbers he put up. China, he says, charges the U.S. 67% tariffs. Now we have to dig into these numbers, because what does that mean? Is it a sort of a broad number in terms of all U.S. imports into China that gets a sort of 67% tariff? We'll have to dig into that, but let's go through the column, right? 67% tariff. China charges, the U.S. will reciprocate with a 34% tariff charge. South Africa, let me cut down to South Africa. He says South Africa charges the U.S. 60% tariffs on what exactly we don't know, and that they will now reciprocate with a 30% tariff on all South African goods, one imagines. And of course, also giving South Africa a shout out there, as we've been accustomed to. They've got some very bad things going on in South Africa, and the fake news, I suppose they're referring there to the SABC, not wanting to report on. And of course, we have we've certainly dug deep into the executive order. We have analyzed, we have got experts on it, and we have ventilated the issue as best we can. But of course, a lot of it based on misinformation. India charges 52%. They will now be charged 26%. South Korea, 50% tariff that they charge on U.S. goods, 25%. Look, this was a very simplistic speech about what we expected to be, a great deep dive into the details, right? This has been choreographed now for months in terms of these reciprocal tariffs. We are going to have to take a deep dive into these numbers, but essentially what we have now is a 25% tariff that will go into effect at midnight on all foreign-made automobiles into the United States. One imagines that share prices for automobiles on the Nikkei and all the Asian markets that will be opening now will be taking a deep dive as well. But certainly the 25%, 10% across the board is what we understand. And then for South Africa, Trump says we charge them 60% tariffs, and they will now, in return, charge South Africa 30%. Let's also just give you a broad summary of what the president said. He said April 2nd, 2025, American industry will be reborn, destiny reclaimed, make America wealthy again. This is the day to remember, he said. He said that the nation had been pillaged for decades. Foreign leaders have stolen our jobs. Foreign scavengers have torn apart our American dream. The country and taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years. The reciprocal tariffs, if they do it to us, we will do it to them, Mfundo. He talked about non-monetary restrictions that some countries impose on U.S. imports. We subsidize a lot of countries, pointing to big deficits that the United States suffers from, and that we will not be taking it anymore. He talked about how Australian bans U.S. beef, but we're now going to be doing the same thing to them. The USA can no longer continue with unilateral economic surrender. Chronic trade deficits are a national emergency that is a threat to our country. But a lot of else in there. He relitigated the election loss in 2020. He talked about how his election win was so significant, defeating Kamala Harris. He talked about the stock market and the records it reached in his first term. Of course, a different scenario now. He talked about border security, immigration, passing the largest tax cuts in American history. And he also talked about his highest approval rating. So a lot there, certainly.
Well, certainly a lot, but one could still say very little at the same time. As you say, that it was far too broad where really when you speak of the 60% that we're charging against the 30% that they'll now be charging, it's honestly quite confusing because one assumes there would be different tariffs for different industries in most instances. So it's quite interesting what we've heard here, but I suppose the most clearest being the 25% that will be charged now on all foreign-made cars and also that 10% across the board. But then on this matter of the bad things that continue to happen in South Africa, Sherwin, we've been reporting on the DG being there, engaging with White House officials, but it seems the message is still not getting to President Trump if we go by what we've just heard today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've extensively covered Zane Dangle, the DG in the Department of International Relations, his visit and his team from the G20 addressing UN member states here in New York, and then, of course, going down to Washington, D.C. for what had been billed a G20 Troika meeting, essentially the Brazilian president, South Africa's current presidency, and then the future presidency in the vein of the United States. They were now going to discuss some of the asks that the United States had. You know that they've not been attending at the highest levels, the foreign ministers meeting and the finance ministers meeting hosted by South Africa, both in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. And so they were really trying to build on some of the work that Ibrahim Rasool, the ousted former South African ambassador to Washington, had been having in terms of discussions with members of the National Security Council in the White House. And of course, then he was expelled. And so they tried to build on those discussions. And what we understand from Durko is that these discussions were fruitful, quoting them now, and cordial. So one expects that they are seeking to build on that. But again, I mean, this was a speech delivered by the president at a very high level, as you say. He probably has not been apprised of the latest developments in South Africa, and of course, the conservative media writ large, podcasters in the main, have really been taking a deep dive into negative sentiments regarding South Africa, and that's often where the president gets his information, right? He's a vociferous, voracious consumer of conservative media, and the narrative on some of those platforms has not been positive towards South Africa. So the counter narrative certainly is a big focus of the South African government. We understand that there might be delegations coming to the United States in the future, but this continues to be a work in progress. The president again reiterating his negative position on South Africa, and that really needs to be countered now in a very bold way. And one imagines that will take effect once President Ramaphosa has settled on a replacement for Ibrahim Rasool. And of course, there are a number of names that are being bandied about, but nothing confirmed as yet.
Interesting times, Sherwin. Most certainly quite interesting to see how the world will respond to just this big announcement dubbed Liberation Day of these reciprocal tariffs. But thank you very much for that reportage, as always. That's SABC News U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. They're just taking us through some of the announcements, or at least some of what was contained in that announcement of reciprocal tariffs.